Hi there, this is Lee Lehman. I want to talk to you about astrology and the martial arts. Now, some of you are probably aware I wrote a book called Astrology and the Martial Arts. This is not so much about that, but this is about how to compare the teaching of astrology and the learning of astrology to the teaching and learning of martial arts. Because as I was studying both, I realized there were a lot of things in common between them, and I think by doing this comparison, we can come to some interesting conclusions and learn something about both of them. Now, both astrology and the martial arts are quite ancient, and actually a little more is known about the study of astrology historically than about the martial arts, but they certainly both go back to the Paleolithic. They are both basically things that a lot of people were interested in over a long period of time. But we can really only talk about the teaching of martial arts clearly in, let's say, about the last 150 years. And what I want to talk about in terms of the teaching of astrology also corresponds to that period, because in the earlier period where astrology was taught in universities, it was much different than it is now. So basically, the practitioners of both recognize both as being forms of art and also forms of technique. And that's really what the two of them have in common, is this idea of art and technique. And so the question that they both raise is, how do you teach these? Well, in both cases, you teach them primarily by having a teacher who imparts these ideas. So let me talk first about how martial arts is taught. Well, of course, martial arts is a nice name and a kind of a civilized name for fighting techniques. And so how it's taught now depends primarily on the extent to which the practitioners, both student and teacher, recognize and acknowledge and value the fact that it is basically a fighting technique. To the extent that the martial art has been formalized, something like karate, what is usually taught is a combination of what are basically sequences of moves. In karate it's called kata. In taekwondo, which is partly derived from karate, it's called forms. And this is a memorized sequence, a choreograph, if you will, of various techniques that to a large extent is designed to both teach the student the techniques and to demonstrate to a lesser or greater extent their mastery of those techniques. In addition to that, some form of free fighting is also taught. Now, a very similar thing in astrology, which is that when astrology is taught by a teacher as opposed to learning strictly by books, how it's taught is basically there's a series of memorized components, the glyphs or symbols for the signs and planets, the shape of a chart, some general meanings of Aries, the meaning of a sextile. And then there's kind of the equivalent of the free fighting, which is, okay, let's look at this chart. And so in both cases you have a series of things that the student has to memorize, and then also that same thing, which is a series of things that a student applies. Now, let me ask a question. If you're talking about the martial arts, to what extent would anybody be considered a master of the martial arts based on reading books about the martial arts alone? To which the answer is not very much. You go into a video store and there's a clerk there who shows you all those lovely martial arts movies, and he might even tell you that he has a black belt, but the odds are he never actually studied with a teacher. He watched the films, or he got the books. Now, it's interesting because in astrology, a large number of astrologers believe that they can learn astrology from books. But this is where it gets back to how much technique do they actually know. It's really hard to learn astrology simply from books, and it's only going to be successful to a degree if, in addition to the books, you also really work very hard at doing the applications. And they're having a teacher who can kind of look over your shoulder and see whether you're doing them right, can actually be very valuable to see that you are applying the techniques. Now, it's interesting because neither martial arts or, for the most part, astrology at this point in time have any real university or college footing. Now, in astrology, we've got Kepler College, and we also have Avalon School of Astrology, and we have some master's programs, such as the program at Lampeter in Wales. But these, at the moment, are not the central ways of teaching astrology, and they are adding something different into the mix of how astrology is understood, and I suspect that this difference will expand in the future. But as far as a practically based system, can it be fully transmitted without the university focus? Well, as long as it's based on practicality, to a large extent it can. Now, I have commented in one of these accompanying videos about how critical thinking can add considerably to the process by which one understands and practices astrology. But techniques can be transmitted without being in a university setting. It's a whole lot easier as a student-to-pupil operation. And if you query the vast majority of people who call themselves astrologers in this country, and I have to include myself, we all learned from books. Now, is it as easy to learn from books now as it was when I was doing this 30-odd years ago? That's really a hard question. And from that standpoint, the advent of the Internet has certainly changed the ways that one can learn and understand, because there are other opportunities besides books in terms of Internet resources as well. So, yes, you can do it, but you get back again to this whole thing. Who checks your work? In martial arts, there's always that added check that that even as you go up the ranks in black belt, the odds are you still have some instructor who's in a position to check your work. And this process of checking work is absolutely a vital process.